Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week, we're sharing an interview with Will Gillis, author of the recently published book, Did the Science Wars Take Place? The Political and Ethical Stakes of Radical Realism, published by C4SS, where Gillis holds the position of the Voltairine de Cleyre Chair of Centrifugal Studies and Technical Coordinator. For the hour, we talk about the so-called science wars of the 1990s, debates involving scientific approaches and shared understandings of a measurable physical reality, post-modernism, the roles leftists and anarchists played in the debates, and how cults and authoritarianism employ anti-realist explanations of the world to limit their subjects' moves towards liberation. You can read more of Gillis's writings at humaniterations.net or c4ss.org, and check our show notes for links for further reading.
My name is William Gillis. I write for a variety of different outlets, but prominently among them the Center for a Stateless Society, and I use they, them pronouns.
Thank you very much for being willing to have this chat with me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This is really great.
So, William, for the audience, William recently released their first book via C4SS entitled Did the Science Wars Take Place? The Political and Ethical Stakes of Radical Realism. Congratulations on this.
Thank you.
So before we get into the book, I'd appreciate if you wouldn't mind saying a few things about C4SS and the ideas that project supports.
Yeah, so the Center for a Stateless Society is a media center and publishing project for left market anarchists like mutualists, roughly anarchists who are committed to egalitarian and the destruction of capitalism in the sense of bosses, classes, poverty, corporations, etc., but who make a distinction between that and markets, that is to say, like voluntary trade networks. Markets have a long existence. They've been in virtually every society or culture, including relatively egalitarian ones. Think women selling vegetables in the village square, traders and tinkerers wheeling their wares around. But capitalism is a recent creation whereby immense coordinated violence was used to dispossess huge amounts of people, giving them no choice but to slave under a boss. And capitalism depends upon constant violent intervention in a host of ways to not just keep those workers dispossessed, but to stop market competition from eroding wealth, since there are dramatic economic inefficiencies, actually, that are inherent to corporations and billionaires, or even tyrannical bosses in small businesses. So left market anarchists, like those of us at C4SS, analyze the world and the myriad ways in which markets are constantly being suppressed in it. Think of the murders of Eric Garner or Mohammed Bouazizi to keep capitalism and the rich afloat. So we've been a part of the anarchist movement since its inception. Left market anarchists have been. It was market anarchist Diarty Lum who smuggled Louis Ling his dynamite in Chicago, and it was a market anarchist who saved and compiled the largest collection of anarchist materials in North America, the Lobby Day collection. Unfortunately, there's a nasty movement that formed in the 1950s called anarcho-capitalism that tries to appropriate from us while defending pretty much every hierarchy in existence. So much of what the Center for a Stateless Society does is critique those people and try to make them see the light, sometimes by turning back their own arguments on them. And this means that we attract both regular anarchists who have become convinced that some form of markets are necessary for coordination and that hawking books at a book fair isn't some deep sin. And we attract former right libertarians who've been convinced to more consistently oppose domination. This is perhaps unfortunate in some sense because as we've converted people out of right libertarianism, those who remain have become much worse on average.
But you can't be blamed for that. So,
well, I blame myself.
To move on to the book, could you give a synopsis of the term science wars, what it colloquially describes, the tensions between the sciences and the run-up, and some of the provocateurs that listeners might be familiar with?
Yeah. So the science wars is remembered by many as a conflict in the 1990s between academics that spilled over into mainstream discourse and media, mostly over a famous hoax article that a Marxist physicist named Alan Sokal got published in a Marxist zine called Social Text. The article denied that any physical reality existed, asserting that matter is just something that we make up and that all that exists are social relations, and it endlessly cited things that a specific Marxist writer, Stanley Aronowitz, who was an editor at Social Text, had written that were false, ignorant, or bad, while heaping praise on him. Aronowitz, he had been dallying with a movement called postmodernism that was kind of half academic and half subcultural. A handful of people in the United States, primarily around a guy named Lotinger at Columbia University in New York, had started translating and republishing some French philosophers and circulating them in zines. This caught on in no small part thanks to the NAMBLA theorist collaborator with the Shah in Iran and supposed chaos magician Peter Lamborn Wilson, who also went by Hakim Bey. But like across the board on the left at this time, there was a certain understandable hostility to the institutional, like scientific world and its complicity with the military-industrial complex and the monolithic cultural and infrastructural mega machine that countries like the United States were turning into. Many leaped onto a rather reductive critique of fascism as totalitarianism that had the benefit of also applying to the US and USSR. So there was a sense in which scientific models like that of gravity were considered totalizing. That is to say, they attempted to speak universally. And there was this fear that such universality was somehow the same thing as imperialism and fascism. So there was a lot of interest by the hippies, basically, in mysticism, faith healing, quackery, whatever, to push back against science. And thus, Aronowitz had written a book called Science as Power that rather hilariously misrepresented a bunch of science and philosophy, but also followed a narrative that was popular on the left at the time. Aronowitz was motivated by trying to save components of Marxism like teleology, which basically in this context means the notion that aggregate things have an internal intended character or destiny that is more or less or more powerful than the nature of their constituent parts. And he was trying to defend that from physics, which disproves that sort of thing. Similarly, Lamborn Wilson was trying to legitimize chaos magic and quote unquote violating boundaries by appealing to philosophers like the post-structuralist Lyotard, who had endorsed a return to paganism in a certain sense, and Paul Feyerabend, who had defended faith healing and praised Mao enslaving and murdering scientists, saying that the same should be done in the West. And what's important to note is that long before this intra-Marxist conflict and this big academic, public media show, there was, anarchists, feminists, and anti-fascists and myriad other leftists were often quite critical of postmodernists and the jumble of arguments or positions often found among them. So, this was anarchists and feminists heckling and critiquing French post-structuralists when they came to New York in the mid-1970s, but it also included figures as diverse as John Zerzan and Murray Bookchin writing lengthy critiques. And of course, there were raging conflicts in academic philosophy during this time too. But after SoCal's hoax brought these arguments to public mass media kind of attention, a bunch of right-wing demagogues treated SoCal like a champion, and much of the leftist humanities and academia closed ranks around postmodernism, with both sides rewriting the history ever since then, while constantly appealing to it, especially like now, despite it being, almost 3 decades on. And famously, Jordan Peterson accuses anyone and everyone of being a postmodernist while never having read a single thing from it.
When reading this book, initially, I found myself really conflicted around what I was reading in terms of the influence on postmodernism and this totalizing idea of the world. It's kind of funny, I can see Zerzan critiques postmodernism frequently, however, also pushes back on the idea of a universal existence, right? Or we'll talk about the stories that are told by the mega machine or whatever as this totalizing imposition. Can you break down a little bit, unless we do this a little bit later in a different question, but the sort of tension between the idea of this totalizing critique and the maybe some of the good-natured anti-imperialist approach towards reflecting on Western Eurocentric stories of the world. For instance, my sister was talking to me about her realization that the term Middle East is kind of a screwed up term for a region because it definitely centers experience from the UK looking in this direction in terms of how far the empire reached. I don't know, that's kind of a weird example maybe, but let me drop this and I'll try to return to it later in a different way.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's totally fine. I mean, I think the term totalitarian gets used in a lot of different ways. And one of the things I wanted to draw out really early on in the book was the ways in which it was being thrown at anarchists in ways that are perhaps obviously unfair. And going off of that, once that's recognized, being oh, well, there are other instances where this is being thrown at scientific models of reality that are likewise unfair, where the things that we want to critique with critiques of totalitarianism One, I mean, maybe we can get into this later, but totalitarianism maybe isn't the best understanding of fascism as a movement, but it is certainly the case that there are, imperialist universalist tendencies, settler colonialism, Christianity, what have you, that want to impose like a single perspective upon the world. But, when anarchism is totalizing in a certain sense and our rejection of domination, that got us critiqued or attacked by Marxists who were themselves pro the state and gulags. So that individuals who were particularly authoritarian would say that anarchists were the real totalitarians because we didn't allow for there to be any space for domination left. And so I think we have to be like very careful about what we think of as, or what we're critiquing and what we think of as like the enemy or the thing that we're working against. And I'm not unsympathetic to many of the currents within, especially like decolonial tendencies. I mean, I'm not unsympathetic, but very sympathetic. But at the same time, there's limits to certain things where an approach that one had maybe breaks down a little, and it becomes necessary to say like, oh, what did we actually mean here when we're using these words? This word kind of sounds like this word, or this use case of it kind of rhymes with this other use case, but are they really the same thing? Are we really like poking at the same thing here? And that isn't to say that I don't think it's super critical that we, critique actually existing science as a social practice or a set of institutions. Science kind of sometimes the phrase operates as this near mythical symbol of authority that's constantly being appealed to by bureaucrats and reactionaries. But at the same time, it's productive to talk of science as a way of thinking or as like a set of desires or motivations. Liberal critics of science will often argue that we can't let pursuit of the world be done for its own sake. And they'll say that it's critical that we like enslave scientists under the signifier of democracy or social control to make sure that we only learn things that are useful for making widgets or curing diseases, and whatever is voted on is the most important. But there's an explosion of inquisition or desire in a lot of children, and those that survive beatings under the education system long enough become scientists. And I think this should be pursued as an end in itself. And that's a very like totalizing or universalistic kind of like thinking process, the process towards trying to understand everything, trying to go further, to not be tied down to parochial, like local contexts or specific contexts. And I think that can be cast in a certain way as totalizing or totalitarian or universalistic or imperialistic, but it's and it can sometimes be utilized as a cover for immense violence, dispossession, oppression, but it doesn't have to be. And it's critical that we like think very clearly about what is actually going on and not get like these things conflated.
I mean, I'm critical of the term. Like totalitarianism was brandished after World War II in a lot of ways by reactionary forces that could no longer talk about themselves as being pro-fascist, but they could talk about communism as being a totalizing system, like state communism. And it became in the vogue to say, look at these two systems, they're the same. Any question of, challenging, and therefore, slippery slope, any challenge towards the idea of like concentration of private property and class society and anything that we've got right now. This society that beat fascism and fought off communism is like leaning towards totalitarianism. Like, yeah, I wasn't so much meaning to jab at that. I was just trying to find a way to sort of play with that idea a little bit.
Yeah, and it's a recurring tendency, right? And I think it's hard to extract anything else that's said or that one would talk about in terms of the book from that topic, because postmodernism itself, I think, at least as I start talking about it, like centered on that narrative of we're resisting the totality, right? And it became like this kind of one of the core components. And so everything else kind of like flows around this question of like, is this actually totalizing in a bad sense? What does that mean? Like, are there appropriate times when you can speak of universalities? Are there inappropriate times, et cetera?
Well, maybe this would be a good time to actually introduce that question about like definitions. Would you mind talking about postmodernism as an idea or as a framework, how it developed, as it's used by various parties, because it's used differently by different people as a term, to the point that, Jordan Peterson, as you mentioned, will like use it as a slur. I've heard other philosophers use it as a slur. But there's other terms that you bring up in the book, radical realism and anti-realism, that figure heavily into the way that map the arguments as they proceed throughout, like in the run-up to the quote-unquote science wars and up until today.
Yeah, so postmodernism is notoriously nebulous as a term, and it's more like a cluster identification in the sense that it's kind of like these people with some common associations and some common perspectives. And I think that's fair to do with some terms and with some movements and circles of people, but it means that as a consequence, it's abused a lot, especially by the right. Jordan Peterson will say that anarchists are postmodernists because we're egalitarian and anti-authoritarian, or that all queer and trans people are postmodernists. And then other people will accuse anyone who's arguing irrationally of being a postmodernist by virtue of having argued irrationally. So in that sense, it's operating as a slur without a lot of depth. And it's understandable that I think many people go, oh, okay, if the term doesn't mean actually anything and you want to call me that, fine, okay, whatever. But I would argue, and I argue quite strongly in the book, that postmodernism is an actual movement or milieu that did exist, especially in the 1980s, however distributed, where people self-identified with that label. And even if many of the original post-structuralist thinkers in France didn't identify with it as an ideological flag, it became one. So in my book, I trace like this loose milieu of people and the set of perspectives that were common among them. And I highlight, as I said, like this totalitarianism analysis, whereby fascism is seen as a universalizing impulse. And in response, you can kind of see postmodernism as this like, well, okay, if fascism is totalizing, then we have to be everything that's not totalizing. So it becomes this reactive embrace of values like particularity, difference, plurality, transgression, illegibility, and humility. All of those can be totally fine or good in some contexts, but when those values or those words get fetishized as like core unassailable goods, like evaluate the situation, what creates more legibility. Whatever does is therefore better, right? Like that doesn't work. And taken as ends to themselves, they can be taken to very reactionary conclusions. And I want to say, like, as with any movement or ideology, there's variation. Like, not every postmodernist would embrace everything there. And that said, though, there's it's common overlap. Like, it's things that you find as like recurring currents. And I think this is true of like any ideological or subcultural space. Libertarianism, liberalism, anarchism. I would hope in anarchism everyone agrees that domination is wrong. But if you go to like libertarianism or neoliberalism, it's a cluster concept. There's a variety of different things that people believe in, and not everyone believes in every one of those things. But they all and not everyone associates with everyone else, but they all kind of associate with each other, and they all kind of like mostly like cluster around the same things. So it's very hazy, and that's imperfect in some ways, but it's just inherent to being able to describe social movements and like currents in society. Anti-realism exists within this cluster of values as one of the core ones, or one of the like most reemergent ones, and it was very important to the science wars, but not every postmodernist was anti-realist. So anti-realism versus realism is the central topic of my book. And also, these are like very technical terms in philosophy with many slightly varying uses. And they're not like terms of abuse necessarily, although people can use them as terms of abuse. I don't like anti-realism, but there are philosophers who quite strongly self-identify as anti-realists. And there are philosophers who, of either side, who will use the term anti-realism and realism. So it has a very technical sense, although those technical definitions will go in different directions. So I should define what they are. So broadly, realism is the stance that there's a single reality with some universal structure that we can figure out and model to at least some degree. And anti-realism basically says nuh-uh about varying aspects of that, right? So there's, as a consequence, as I said, like lots of versions. And in the book, I laboriously go through them in part to show that different versions of anti-realism or different arguments often opportunistically jump between one another. So someone will be making one argument in one style of anti-realism, and then will slip into a different style of anti-realism in order to avoid an attack upon that one, right? And then slip back when they need to. Yeah. And I also make this distinction between radical realism and fundamentalist realism. And in that case, they're mostly my chosen terms, although there are a few individuals who have used either phrase. Radical realism is the notion that the structures of the universe are under no obligation to be easily knowable by some random primates like us, right? So we have to work very hard to delve under appearances to what simplifications are useful to us, or underneath those simplifications to find what's a true universal root dynamic. But it may be like very alien, and it means sometimes discarding what turns out to just be like a sloppy rule of thumb that we imposed upon the world and that isn't actually universal in the world. Fundamentalist realism, on the other hand, asserts that we can know reality. Well, I mean, all forms of realism assert that to some extent, but that we already do. And it's kind of simple that appearances and common sense are likely to be true with only some minor corrections. This is sometimes called naive realism in the populist literature, but there's a lot of different variations of it that I wanted to kind of group together pretty implicitly in the book to save space and show how there's a common impulse driving that.
There is an interesting point that you make, and I'm full disclosure, I am not a scientist. I do not knowingly practice or am trained in any sciences, not because you all are witch burners, but just, because it's just not where I focus my attention. But I find it really fascinating, and I'd love to learn more or get into the practice. But one thing that you return to, I think, throughout the book in terms of the idea of reality, and I want to ask more questions about the concept of science, but just to sort of touch on a thing, simplicity with the fundamentalist realists is something that is like the world is present. The world is actually simple to understand in that vision. But there is like a value to simplification that you expressed, and I think it's from your physicist background, or maybe just from a scientific background, because I guess mathematicians talk about it a lot, but the idea of lossless reducibility in understanding the universe or how reality is constructed. And I know there's a question later on that talks about this. I'm familiar with this term from exporting audio basically on computers or graphics. There's smaller images or smaller audio files that may to our ears or our eyes seem like pretty full of depth are oftentimes a reduced version of those initial files, those initial raw recordings that, if you have the ability to delve in or listen with an exceptionally good set of ears or a set of headphones, you might notice pops and cracks or like background noises from a couple streets down or whatever in that raw, lossless version. The lossy version is something that's easy to spread around. Can you talk about just the idea among realists of simplicity and this ideal of lossless compression or compression?
Yeah, so among realists, especially in formal philosophy, lossless compression and simplicity kind of has a bad name. That's not true for all of them, and they're significant holdouts. But among physicists, especially the people who were involved in the science wars, a lot of them were leftist-y physicists of some kind who were critiquing the more postmodern and relativist side of things. For those folks, and in the physics community, lossless reduction, lossless compression is incredibly valuable. And people will maybe not use exactly those words for it, but very similar ones in a variety of different ways all the time to talk about like what is the thing that we're pursuing and the thing that we find is like proof that we've like successfully achieved, a correct model of things. And I think it was important to me to go in depth with like physics examples in the book and put equations in on one page. I promise they're short equations. You don't have to read them. And they're simple math. But even though my editor was very unhappy with the with the equations, because no one wants to read those.
For aesthetic reasons. Okay.
I thought it was important to go into that in part because the experience of certain realms of core science, what I would call the radical sciences, is so different from everyday human experience and the intuitions that we build up. There is no such thing as lossless compression in everyday human life. It does not exist. If you take an audio file and you compress it, you lose something. But what if you could take an audio file and compress it and then uncompress it and you would not have lost anything? And that's what you can do in some instances in some radical sciences and math. And in some sense, all of science, well, especially those in the natural sciences, are striving for some degree of at least less lossy compression. And that like an effective model of reality is a model of reality that manages to compress, to take everything that we know and create a compression that doesn't actually lose anything, that makes it easier for us to like, visualize, engage with, work with, state, even if it's not necessarily work with, because it can be incredibly hard to work with, but like find some way to compress it that can be uncompressed into everything without loss of anything. And of course, that's over a domain, over a specific thing. And the difference ends up playing out on whether or not you're evaluating a macroscopic system like humans. I mean, we're much, much larger than a microscopic system, right? So there's countless particles all involved in all these countless things like our brains. There's all these infinite, basically, connections and relations and processing that's happening. And if you had a computer that could model everything and take the physics of it and then put in the core physics, you could build out the whole system and you could watch the whole system. At least that's the lossless reductionist account. It is impossible to do in practice because we have limitations in computation, we have limitations in storage of things, but there are things that, like electromagnetism, you have electromagnetism plays this role. It has all these different features, all these different things around the world, all kind of share a same underlying dynamic. That dynamic is universal. And when you take all those different features, all those different things that you thought were different things, you can actually unify them into one thing. And you can show, and then you can take the thing at the core that you had, and you can reproduce everything that you were originally like simplifying it down, and nothing is lost when you rebuild it. And the examples that I give are out of mathematics, so they're like really simple examples around like algebra and like polynomials or something, and that kind of stuff to show you how that is possible in math. How there's like you can write an equation in a really messy, long, complicated way, or you could write it in a very simple, short way. And in mathematics, there's things called complexity hierarchy. That's how cryptography, in some sense, like arises. In some ways, there's all sorts of different things you could start to say there more concretely, but something could be a lot more lossy and a lot less lossy. And the more human scale, our science oftentimes looks like trying to find the less lossy compressions. But the radical instinct in science does not settle for merely good enough. It wants perfect compression. It wants universality, like absolute universality. So if there's something that is lost in a simplification or something that is obscured or there's an exception, then a certain type of scientist looks at that and is like, absolutely not. Something has gone wrong. Sometimes they look at it with incredible excitement, like, oh my God, we found an exception. The symmetry that we thought existed in nature doesn't actually exist. There's this thing over here. How does that change everything? But it changes everything, because at that point, like, your old system doesn't work. So maybe it works to some approximation, but you need to find the thing that is better than that approximation. You need to find the thing that works always. And that pressure, that drive for lossless compression, as I phrase it, drives certain chunks of science and what I would consider to be the core of science, physics most notably among them, but you can look at like chemistry, certain components of biology, mathematics, computer science, or some components of computer science. And like these things all kind of have intersections, and you can also see it present out in other fields of study. And fortunately, there are some fields of study that are very different from one another, so it's hard to do sort of combinations or comparisons. And then there are others that basically turn into the same thing under high degrees of radical pressure. So that core distinction between the radical and the non-radical, between the lossless and the not lossless, is this very important conceptual distinction throughout the book. And when it comes to fundamentalists and reactionaries, one of the things that I wanted to bring to the fore, and maybe we can get into this later, is the way in which their assumptions and their notion of realism depend really hard upon, well, it's good enough. This assumption, this model that we have, it's good enough. And as you were saying with simplicity, there's this impulse in reactionary politics, reactionary perspectives, to achieve the simple at any cost. And that cost can be just simply ignoring the exceptions, but it can also be violently suppressing the exceptions. And I think there is a natural tendency of people who are living in everyday human life and are conventional everyday to see the drive for the simple as inherently reactionary, because the people who we are most likely to encounter who who are pressing for the simple are people who would accomplish it through violent ends and who would suppress and ignore incredibly important exceptions. But it is not the case that, at least I argue, I believe, many physicists believe, whatever, that kind of lossiness that we experience in our everyday life is inherent. And I think a lot of physicists would believe that, or experience and can demonstrate instances where the drive for losslessness is productive and doesn't do violence, doesn't strip away important details and important realities, it doesn't leave an impoverished model of reality. Of course, people will be like, well, we're not just a collection of atoms, blah, blah, blah. And of course, there's importance to all the arrangement and the structure and the history and all of those things. But the point being that you can reproduce, you can, in some sense, take certain subsections of reality, notice common trace lines throughout them, and pull out of it, oh, this is universal symmetry. This is a universal connection. We can actually say that this is universal without papering over some exception, without being like, oh, well, put this to the side. And that doesn't apply at the large scale, at the normal human life. We just can't do that.
I think like a distinction, and this is, I think, going back to something that you said earlier, but between this, like the fundamentalist approach maybe believes that like there are understood fundamentals, and the approach of science is about finding the data that will fit into the model that they fundamentally have. Whereas the radical approach, meaning, as you put it in the book a number of times, getting to the root, is happy to be like shifted and have the rug pulled underneath it because it's seeking perfection, even if that's an unattainable.
And that search radically transforms you, right? Because if you're looking for the roots and you don't assume that you're already going to have it, or that the simple things that you have that are more or less good are sufficient, you're going to constantly, or perhaps just for a while, depending upon the thing you're looking into, be changing things entirely. You'll pull a thread and realize the whole thing unravels. You'll look into his thing, find the exception, and have to delve deeper. And as a consequence, you get changed by this search. And so much of reactionary politics is a fear of change, and a fear that if you leave home and you go on a journey, you'll come back a different person, that like globalism, queerness, what have you, will change you. And so the radical is kind of like unafraid of that, and even a champion of that kind of change, because they think that whatever they find, like you should seek the truth regardless of whether the truth changes you. And the reactionary, in many cases, doesn't believe that there is a true universal truth out there. And so just sees, like, if you go off beyond the horizon, you're going to come back a Lovecraftian monster changed by who knows what. We can't allow that, because they have no allegiance to this distant unknown thing of like whatever the actual true universal is. They have allegiance to whatever they started out with, and they will defend that pretty violently, even epistemically violently.
Yeah, so we've kind of like wandered into the concept of just talking about science generally, which I think is great. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about science as discussed in the book, about the institutions, the industries and agencies engaging in it, and how it is or can be differentiated from a scientific approach and the accumulated body of knowledge. Like, in your opinion, well, you've already expressed, I mean, if you identify as a radical realist, that it is possible for the world to be known, or the universe to be known.
To some degree.
Okay. So in addition to because these are all like 3-part questions, I guess let's break it down. Could you talk a little bit about when people talk about science, in particular, like when some of the characters in your book, call them characters because they were characters, even if real people, when they were referring to science, capital S science, can you talk about some of the industries, agencies, institutions that they were critical about, and also what other people were referring to, the say like radical real people that you would identify as a radical realist, how they identify science and as an approach, maybe differentiate those two?
So it's important to note that there were criticisms of science as social practice that never really were critiqued by the science warriors, or that the science warriors never really seem to have a problem with. And this becomes a distraction when telling the history of the science wars, because much of the science wars was about realism versus anti-realism. And many of the folks who were drawn towards positions that touched anti-realism, were anti-realist, defended anti-realists, provided cover for them, were primarily oriented towards critiquing science as actual social practice and the institutions that actually exist. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? And so, I read hundreds of books and hundreds of papers to write this book. And it becomes quite a slog sometimes to read through these volleys back and forth where two sides will be talking past each other, right? Where one side will be critiquing the anti-realism, will be really drilling in on but this person said this extreme thing about how reality is unknowable or is a product of our thoughts and we dream it into existence or whatever. And somebody else will be saying, so you're saying that there should be no checks and balances against capitalism. And it's hard not to have sympathy for both sides of this. I think that there were definitely currents in society, especially some more reactionary conservative currents that were critiquing postmodernists on grounds that tended back to some old fights in the 60s and 70s, where there was a current in scientists among the left that saw science primarily in terms of industry and saw science primarily in terms of what good can it provide to individual people, and was of course horrified by the fact that industrial pharmaceuticals, industrial scale agriculture, whatever, was not actually providing benefits to people as a whole, was being quite horrific, right? And they also were horrified by the hierarchies that were gelling in science at that time, the institutional hierarchies, the domination, the complicity with the military-industrial complex. And their critique was a sociological critique, an institutional critique. And I think it's worth noting, even though SoCal has revealed himself as quite a reactionary, at least on gender issues, that individuals on the science warrior side of things repeatedly made statements where they're like, we don't care about those critiques, as in we think it's fine and good that you make those critiques. SoCal many times would say I think sociological critique of the actual existence, and institutions of science is incredibly necessary. I share in these critiques. I want you to publish these critiques. I hate this. What I'm taking issue with is these things over here. And I think there was also some uncharitable or opportunistic degree to which many of the defenders of the postmodernist side of things and the anti-realist postmodernists, because there were postmodernists who were just uninvolved, and there was a separate crew called the relativist sociologists who were basically very, very tightly in coalition with the postmodernists. Those folks would oftentimes, I think, very disingenuously deflect from one critique and try to jump back on the other critique because they knew that no leftist would disagree with that, or no radical or person focused on egalitarianism or liberation would disagree with that. But I do think at the same time, it's, you can't disentangle entirely the broader social discourse that was happening and the broader continued arguments and discussions that were happening. But at the same time, I don't find myself in alignment with certain scientists in the 1960s and 1970s who saw science as more engineering and saw the issue as one of democratic control. In my book, I harp maybe unproductively on a distinction between scientists and engineers, because in my experience, they have almost totally opposed ways of looking at and engaging with the world. As we've discussed, radicalism and finding dynamics beyond first appearances is very different from the kind of practical and pragmatic tinkering and investigation for instrumental reasons to accomplish some other end. And I noticed very early on in my personal participation in political discussions within STEM spaces that things would split very hard, oftentimes, almost always, with those of a more engineering or applied background being present on the wrong side of the table. And there's a ton of sociological data, it actually turns out, consistently backing up the story in every nation and throughout history or the last century, that this is a strong divide between engineering, the engineering disciplines, and the more core theoretical scientific disciplines, which isn't to say that engineers are universally bad or that scientists are magically universally anarchists with great politics. That's definitely not true. And, we need engineers in practical tinkering. Squats and radical spaces require engineering. Some of my best friends are engineers. But this highlights the utopian and radical inclinations of pure science, which is also why before World War II, physicists were publicly seen as overwhelming on the far left. And much of the Manhattan Project and the post-war state apparatus very intentionally tried to beat the shit out of pure science and transform it into something that operated and thought more like an engineering discipline. And I think that many of the leftists who had critiques of science on a sociological and institutional dynamic had many correct critiques of those dynamics. But at the same time, their end goal or their like takeaway was that we should make science more like an engineering discipline. We should just change who had control of the leash, right? We should shift things over from being scientists should do the bidding of the industrial, capitalist leaders and the military industrial complex. And we should shift it over to they're like controlled by the democratic communes. And there's no space in there for science as a goal in and of itself. There's no space in there for inquisitiveness for its own sake. And there's no awareness of even like the notion of the search for truth or the search for like universal like structures and relations. It just becomes, how can this cash out in like benefits to us? And don't get me wrong, there should be engineering and technology and like applied concerns. There needs to be like medicine for people in need. There need to be things like that. We can have many critiques of how that's applied and how the infrastructure functions and et cetera. And I have many. But what I think is evacuated from that discussion is the value of the radical approach of science in and of itself. I have a lot of sympathy and solidarity with those like Science for the People who were engaged in that kind of critique and focused on those issues. But at the end of the day, I think that they were focused more on a technological direction, and one that I also think is like somewhat implicitly authoritarian. This notion that democracy should control science is authoritarian. I feel like people should be free to inquire and to investigate and to delve and to look into things and collaborate on that as a goal in and of itself, in part because understanding the world and understanding reality is, I think, deeply enmeshed with and inseparable from the act of choice, having agency, having freedom at all. So I think that there is a distinction between sociological critiques that critique the function and the actual lived experience of science and the, in society and the institutions, et cetera, and critiques that ignore the existence of science in other forms, like the inquiry, search for roots, et cetera, and not just ignore, but as a consequence, devalue that.
The Final Straw Radio is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Now on the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network, tune into The Beautiful Idea,
a project from a collective of several anarchist and autonomous media producers scattered around the world.
We're bringing you interviews and stories from the front lines of autonomous social movements and struggles,
as well as original commentary and analysis.
Episodes include action news, interviews with frontline organizers, and deep dive discussions.
Check out thebeautifulidea.show and the Channel Zero network for more information.
If you want to support the Final Straw Radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various streaming platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.media. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce for each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Stripe, Venmo, or LibrePay. Or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies via the links that you can find at tfsr.media/support. Finally, if you'd like to hear us on your local radio station, visit tfsr.media/radio to find more info or reach out to us for some help. Thanks for listening. Even if it's individuals pursuing things, it doesn't mean that they're also not going to be getting ideas from other people, kicking back the things that they find because they're excited about it, and that feeds back into the collective pool of knowledge. So I believe that you posit that postmodernism, despite at times being championed by leftists and promoted more widely as a leftist project of social degeneracy by right-wing talking heads, actually serves reactionary worldviews better. Can you talk about this, if we want to call it subterfuge, and how it plays out in things like a Volkish mindset, patchwork approaches to things like human rights, and real concerns about imposed cultural hegemony from the imperial core?
It's a well-documented fact that many reactionary religious folks, and much, if not most, of the major fascist movements in the world pulled quite heavily from postmodernism and some associated relativists in the science wars. So you have climate change deniers, creationists, folks like that who have all been quite public about this, and their embrace was praised and supported by some major postmodernist and relativist figures. And the two competing financial and intellectual loci of the international fascist movement. The New Right in France and Alexander Dugin in Russia are fervent, explicit champions of postmodernism. They use the word, they drape it on things, they go on postmodernist podcasts sometimes. Meanwhile, even a number of the core chuds in the kind of like MAGA Trump world have ties. So it is important to ask why. And it's critical that we remember that fascism is not the same thing as every imperialism. Fascism emerged, especially in its National Socialism form in Germany, as a defense of national particularity and difference. It saw itself as preserving the local against the global, protecting rural culture against Hollywood. This wasn't just like dishonest branding. It was like core motivational stuff to a lot of them. Now, naturally, the Third Reich saw an absolute state as the means to achieve these ends, and this involved the suppression of difference within the state, and they definitely wanted to expand via the extermination of people like the Slavs, but the Nazis saw themselves as paternalistic liberators of many nations like France, who they were purifying of the corrupting globalist influence and allowing to return to their national particularity. And a lot of thought in Nazi circles was grounded in and revolves around this rejection of universals. They were incredibly hostile to physics, which is part of how they failed to build a nuclear bomb. The chief philosopher of the Nazi regime, Heidegger, was all about encouraging people to embrace their thrownness, as his term, that is to say, the particularities of their existence, their happenstance birth. And Heidegger blamed the Jews for their extermination because in his mind, the Jews had pushed universality, and thus it was only fitting that they would be slaughtered by modern technology. And although that's a kind of a myth about the Holocaust, it was largely a very messy, chaotic, low-tech, very gruesome thing, which gets obscured in the public vision by these images of IBM racks and, gas chambers, but that was only one small component of it. But you can see the danger of the fervent embrace of Heidegger by folks on the left around the 60s and 70s and the emergent postmodernist movement. And those who critique fascism solely as a homogenizing force miss how critically it relies upon relativism and cutting off consideration or empathy beyond some border. The preservation of overall difference in national identity necessitates in their mind slaughter to preserve borders, customs, And this isn't to say that global homogeneity is necessarily good either. Certainly not like imperial cultural hegemony. Liberal capitalist democracy can be quite evil on its own without that being the same thing as fascism. There are, of course, many negative universals. Christianity, settler colonial missionaries did unspeakable genocide and horrors. But I would say that I think anarchism and anarchy are correct. And it's just inherently universalizing. Your freedom is my freedom globally. Our solidarity is totalistic, right? And our rejection of domination is totalistic too. We're infamously prickly problem creators in any leftist coalition because we won't compromise with the Marxists or whoever and accept just a little domination or the specific flavor of domination over there. And we oppose all of it. And this has led Marxists and postmodernists, again, to just constantly deride us as actually the true totalitarians, in much the same way that many people have slurred anti-fascists as being the true fascists, right? Yeah, so I think that universalism isn't an inherently bad thing. We have to take care that it doesn't get misappropriated and turned to, defend up shit. Yeah, it's just important to make those distinctions. And that also isn't to say that there aren't forms of the right wing that aren't universalistic, but fascist currents within the right have tended to be very particularistic and promoting a lot of the values of the words that became core flags or fetishes of the postmodernist movement and of people surrounding it. And I just think we have to be very clear about what we're actually talking about and not just short circuit our thoughts on something because this word was applied. And yeah, it's technically different. You're technically defending difference. But why should we care about difference as an abstraction rather than concrete freedom, right? Are these people, are people actually, do they have more choices? Are they more repressed and oppressed in their daily life? And that to me is far more concrete and substantive than a question of but are there customs and cultures more diverse? Do they jingle their bells and dance or whatever in this section of Europe versus the section of Europe in completely different ways? And do we need to have violent borders and incredibly authoritarian regimes in order to preserve that difference, right? Who cares if it dissolves if people do so freely? Is kind of more what I would say.
It's not like any of those cultures are fundamental and essentially trapped in amber things that have never had influence from the outside. It's not like that language group suddenly just popped up and like people have been speaking Magyar since they were born out of the rocks in Hungary or whatever.
Well, people certainly claim, nationalists will certainly make certain claims like that. But I mean, I think like Nandita Sharma has this great book, Home Rule, where she talks about essentially humanity is this kind of Gordian knot where nationalism just inherently has to do violence to the deep complexity of human relations in order to simplify them into these distinct cultures, distinct nations, and this superficial, completely made up history that papers over all the rich complexity of human interrelation. And I think a term that's always stuck with me from an indigenous anarchist conference was this individual said, what we want are not like tradition. Tradition is something dead that lives on a shelf, something like preserved in amber. What we want are lifeways, right? And like something that grow and that we have agency in. And for me, like the great horror of colonialism and imperialism was the futures that it denied to people and the choice that it denied to people in making those futures for themselves. So what would have emerged, what different tweaks of culture and whatever would have emerged from these like communities and the free association of individuals on their own, making new lifeways or changing their lifeways, right? And adapting and growing. And so, I just, this fascist notion of difference becomes this incredibly simplistic, like inherently in order to create this lasting difference, in order to create these divides, they have to strip away and do this incredible amount of violence to stop just the like constant melding and innovation and association that humans will do on their own.
So throughout the book, you share a bit about your experience growing up in what you describe as an anti-realist cult. Correct me if I'm misrepresenting, and the personal stakes that you faced not only during your personal development as a child, but also your survival of an abusive situation. This is counterposed to quotes throughout it by Mirananda on how she saw the empowering of Hindutva perspectives implemented through the BJP to push back struggles that had been moving forward against caste, patriarchy, and ethno-religious nationalism in India. Can you talk a bit about the dovetail between those two perspectives that are presented, the importance of building shared measurable understandings of the world and projects of liberation?
Yeah. As you said, like I grew up in the cult of Christian Science, which is a cult, although it's formally a religion. And it's hard to explain what that means because the words Christian and science are just have almost no relation to either. But they believe that physical matter does not exist and is a mistaken collective dream that we're all having. As a result, they treat things like magic as functionally real, because if you believe hard enough, you can make it real in the collective dream. And they also think that believing at all in like actual like the patterns that science has actually uncovered in the world is responsible for creating and reinforcing our experience of matter, and thus, as a consequence, disease and suffering. This extreme like philosophical idealism that they have is unfortunately pretty common take across a number of religions and like philosophical currents. And it leads Christian scientists to murdering a ton of children because they refuse to bring them to doctors, choosing instead to try to like believe the cancer or the diabetes or the broken bones away. I should nuance that Christian scientists themselves will actually like bristle at the charge of anti-realism because that's not a term that they use. They don't know technical philosophy in that sense. And they would emphasize that idealism, the existence of only minds and not matter, is actually the true reality in this kind of realist way. So, they are kind of imperialists of this notion that matter doesn't exist. But functionally, in a lot of ways, they're anti-realists. And I was shocked as a young anarchist entering the leftist anarchist radical milieu, just... I was trying to escape from this cult, and I found almost exactly the same takes and arguments common that I had like grown up suffering under. Feyerabend, who's this, important philosopher, and the story went to a faith healer in Berkeley when he had cancer. And statistically speaking, it's actually really likely that he went to a faith healer in Christian Science, what they call a practitioner. And if you're in a major city of any kind, you can probably go to the downtown and find a Christian Science reading room staffed by one old white lady who gets no visitors, but she's connected to a network of people who sell their ware of faith healing, right? Like it's a practice. It's widespread. Obviously, like it's fine to have critiques of the medical industrial system. And sometimes you can say, well, like I may endorse this mysticism or skepticism or even philosophical anti-realism. of some kind, but I would just take my kid to the emergency room, right? Like, like I'm going to dabble in whatever, but at the end of the day, I'll take the pill or something. And people will think that that'll like resolve all the problems and be like, oh, well, your cult's completely different. I would just take the pill. And okay, like my childhood cult tried to take anti-realism particularly seriously and to be cogent and coherent about it. But it doesn't mean that just being kind of like an opportunistic about like belief will really get you out of certain things. What I try to argue in the book at length is that anti-realism and realism are intensely self-compounding, that they leak out and infect like everything that you do in a ton of ways. There's not really like a compromise position between the two of them. Folks want to be realists about like really simple everyday matters, like there's a ground, I can kick this rock, the sky is blue. And then they want to be anti-realists about more involved, less intuitive or directly experiential scientific models, like, the existence of electrons or the dinosaurs or something like that was in the ground once upon a time. And, this many, millions of years ago. They want to layer on like a skepticism and ignore the web of overwhelming evidence that's aggressively fencing in like what could be possible. But directness and immediacy is not actually very good proof of anything. Our experiences and intuitions are frequently mistaken and incomplete. Evidence has to build up. It has to create a network of proof. And an infant gradually coming to believe in object permanence is making a scientific model of the world. And that scientific modeling is not categorically different in any substantive way from the way that we gradually congeal models of electromagnetism or electrons. And when folks believe that belief itself makes reality, even if they're inconsistent or pragmatic or, choose to take their kid to the hospital eventually, that assumption that beliefs make reality will inevitably like leak in abusive ways. Even if one is just being overly skeptical or dogmatically refusing to acknowledge increasing probability of a model from the evidence, that skepticism can itself be abusive. Even if you get a kid to overly distrust taking all pills, and thus the kid never takes ibuprofen for a headache, you're inflicting pain on that kid. That's unnecessary. And you're actively denying them informed agency in their choices. We have to have accurate models of reality in order to make substantive choices within it. If you delude someone, if you deliberately facilitate someone having a bad map of reality, you're actually constraining their agency. This means that, we want models that don't overassert or overclaim like, something being true, but we also want models that don't underassert it, that don't ignore evidence when it's there. I know a lot of radicals actually who have permanent lifelong disabilities as a consequence of advice given to them. And I'm personally highly critical of the field of medicine, if only as like, well, there's so many reasons to be critical of the medical institutions as they currently exist, the hierarchies, the biases, et cetera, in them. But, as someone with a physics background, I have a certain snottiness about how they don't have the kind of evidence that we have. They work in crude aggregates of very little data. But there's an extreme skepticism that is pushed in anti-totalitarian, anti-totalism framing as resisting the mega machine and its scientist priests. And it was omnipresent when I was younger, and it did real harm. And I think it still does real harm. And there's, I don't mention any of my friends in the book who experienced things, but I do mention some public figures. And there's like some formal philosophers and stuff who have said like, oh, my buddy told me not to get heart surgery when I would have died without it. And there are people who died as a consequence of the things that were pushed. I name a few of them in the book at various points off the top of my head. It's hard to remember. But anyone who was around in the 1990s, unfortunately, like knows how common hostility to vaccines or belief in like really absurd things was common in radical spaces. And there's a lot of folks now pretending that they never refused to get their kids vaccinated. And sure, okay, fine. Glad to have you update your views. But we all, I think, need to at least learn from like the experience or the fact that all of that happened. Additionally, I think that struggle can't just be performative or emotive. The rubber has to meet the road in like applied ways in the material world. And that inevitably involves needing accurate maps of how matter works. Like scientific style thinking, the kind of radical inquiry into roots can assist us into better analyzing like core dynamics and can thus expose ways in which rules of thumb that, or just basic assumptions we already had, have exceptions. If the mega machine is built by engineering style thinking where works good enough, in conceptual or technical structures is sufficient, the radical realist perspective can help us at least try to find ways that those assumptions break down to reveal a deeper or more universal reality. And perhaps productively as a result, how to exploit those weaknesses or those exceptions. And as a matter of like theme and narrative more generally, I think there's a very real sense in which scientific thinking, like the pursuit of hidden root dynamics, is constitutive. As I said, like it is inseparable from agency and freedom. It's part of the process that is choice. We have to like actually map the world in order to make a choice about how we're going to interact with the world. And so as a consequence, comforting delusions may give us a certain amount of sense of freedom in our own head, but they're just a prison, right? And the drive for universals is not necessarily like the power fantasy of some imperial tyrant out trying to map every coastline so that his military can exploit them, but like something more like, in my mind, the view from anywhere, a view of like refugees, of migrants, of the homeless, where mobility is, across different contexts, it strips away our parochialism and leaves us attracted to what is actually universally stable, certain in any context. And it enables us to better adapt when contexts completely change. Finding universals enable us to travel, to flee if need be, to not be trapped to a certain domain where certain rules or assumptions apply, but we're terrified of leaving it because once we leave that, effective domain of a model or of a view of the world, things will completely break down and our choices won't have traction on reality because we don't know how things will work past that point. If we're looking at we're trying to find more universals and we do find them, then we will have less fear of changing everything. And we will be able to make more informed choice once we pass through that change and thus be more free in that world.
Yeah, and so to bring it back to the Mirananda, I really appreciated the quotes that you interspersed throughout the book and the examples that she gave about, as a woman who grew up in India, the arguments about how the fake ethnic sciences that were being promoted through the RSS and the BJP, the framework that they build sets up people that would adopt these for failure. They would set them up for failure without a correct or possibly liberatory approach towards mapping the world, as you talk about. And so this is where the imposition of caste comes in. I mean, this is not dissimilar from, on a much larger scale, if you want to make the analogy to abusive households or cults, refusing to teach children how to read. And they wouldn't be able to function outside as easily if they escaped. They wouldn't be able to harness that information that's in those books to be able to build a roadmap about how to get from here to there, or have an understanding that there's other ways that the world can exist. And particularly in this world that you described growing up in, where to say something and believe it is to make it real. And if the world does not frame to your ideation of the world, then it's a fault of your own, again, sets the individual up for failure. I found that to be, it touched back to that radical approach towards science. It was really inspirational to read a lot of the quotes from yourself, but also from Mirananda in this, talking about how, and once you get these, once you're allowed to have these tools, once you formulate these tools, then you can take next steps and make sure that this doesn't happen to anyone else or whatever.
Yeah, the book originally grew out of what was going to just be a book review of Mirananda's book. And I ended up stripping out so much of that content, because there's also things, I think her book, Prophets Facing Backwards, is really good. But there are things that I'm quite critical of in that book. She takes a very a kind of developmentalist kind of thing of if only we developed more industry in some places and some stuff that I, would have more of a critical lens on. But I think a lot of the critiques that she has, especially of Vandana Shiva and, fascist collaboration and overlap, are really important. And I think, beyond, one of the things that I tried to make present in the book, beyond just Mirananda, was referencing people's science movements in India, which are grassroots atheist science education movements among the lowest castes, and have millions of adherents and do things basically just they're this vast network of autonomous free schools and training, participatory training programs and activists and stuff like that. And it's such a contrast to how Orientalist perspectives oftentimes portray the non-Western world. And talking about, the degree to which within cults like Christian Science, if you don't heal your injury, you are therefore weak and there's something wrong with you. That dynamic plays out pretty aggressively. And there's also like a religious inheritance. It's a little, it's filtered through a lot of like white bull, but there is a religious inheritance whereby one current of philosophy or religious practice in India actually is pretty, philosophically idealist in some ways, and Christian Science pulls from it, as do Theosophists and a bunch of other currents that emerged in the 1800s by a bunch of Europeans who were really interested in like foreign perspectives, and they took a bunch of those things and they've played forward to immense negative impact in our society. It may be distracting to talk too much about the particular cult that I grew up in, but Christian Science is just one of a great many. The book, The Secret, sold like tens of millions of copies. And there's all these, other religious currents or, occultist tendencies that have the exact same kind of inheritance or the exact same kind of path and believe kind of exactly the same things. And they may be like, well, you need to desire it more. And if you didn't desire it enough, then that's what's wrong with you. Or you need to like have absolute faith in God, et cetera. But like, people who, like, a huge component of this is the evangelical world where you send money to pastors as proof that you're seeding your belief and then money will come back to you magically somehow. And the people who are leveraging that are pulling from the same exact like texts and traditions and like history that Christian Science was a part of. And this includes Trump's favorite pastor, who he sings great praises about and seems to be the only person that he has any sort of religious connection to or experience of. And the things that these people teach is that if you're rich, you got so because you're a better person in some way. And if you're poor, you're oppressed, you're beaten, what have you, anything that you're facing that's wrong with you, no matter how materialistic and just like inherent, like a handcuff on you, that's your fault. You did something wrong. Like, you should be able to wish that handcuff open. You should be able to like wish yourself out of poverty. And if you can't, that's your fault. Yeah, it's perennial in religious traditions, but it's particularly stark in both certain currents of Hinduism is this modern construction that congeals a whole bunch of different things together.
But like caste imposing ideology, right? Like versions of it that are like heavily into karmic repayment, as well as the people being born into castes as a byproduct of their like carrying too much karma.
Yeah, I mean, I specifically focus in on more one specific current. There are subcurrents, so there's like all these different branches of Indian philosophy and of things that became Hinduism. And there's one specific branch that is very idealistic and believes that basically material matter doesn't exist, or that all is spirit, and that spirit is like essentially mental. And so it's kind of similar to like philosophical idealism in the Berkeleyan sense. But it's certainly the case, I'm not going to spare any strand of Hinduism, that like casteism is like built into almost all of them in this really up way. And that is definitely like, even if those currents that believe in karma believe in material reality in the sense of like matter, they believe in matter, they still add in this stuff whereby you're a lower caste and that's your fault. Right. And in addition, in the caste system, the tiering system is all about one's level of like disconnect from material like realities, whereby the lowest castes have to do the most amount of like actual engagement with matter, right? With shoveling the or like tilling the field or whatever. And as you get further up in the hierarchy, in the caste hierarchy, you have less and less contact with matter because you're supposed to be more and more like intellectual, just pure mind, just pure spirit. And that's not unique to India particularly, although like the caste and karmic rebirth system is particularly unique. But like those currents of like the justification of power, oppression, of the distribution of wealth in the world, et cetera, it sure fits smoothly with a wishing makes it real belief. And so that thing will emerge in a lot of different cultures, but like there's definitely a contiguous current. And, people like who were doing chaos magic and like that, or who were trying to like rehabilitate some wingnuts from the 1800s into occultist subcultural traditions in the 1980s, were pulling from those exact same traditions, right? The stuff both, emerges spontaneously anytime that a hierarchy needs to justify itself. And also it is immensely viral. And the genealogy of that virus is pretty broad.
Some 3 decades since the first shots were fired in the so-called science wars, participants have had ample opportunities to make asses out of themselves. Near the end of the book, you speak about some of the expressions of what you call fundamentalist realism by figures like Sokal, as opposed to the approach of radical realism, notably on the discussion of sex and gender. I wondered if you could talk about this a little bit, the difference in approach and thus conclusion on topics of sex and gender, and how they relate to ideas of simplicity and lossless compression, like we spoke about a little bit earlier.
Yeah. So when I start talking about the science wars, for a lot of younger folks, the main way they've heard of them is via something that unfortunately got called by right-wing media SoCal squared, which is in 2018, 3 reactionary professors submitted over 20 contrived articles to minor academic journals to mock things like fat studies, and a handful were accepted and printed. The goal of these professors was to ridicule studying the experience of those pressed along certain lines. And basically, they only proved that peer review at minor journals is not great. And Alan Sokal himself, at the time, kind of immediately made some noise distancing himself and saying how this wasn't at all what his original article was about. And it's true. He wasn't attacking a peer review system. Social Text didn't have a peer review system. He was trying to prove, essentially, that they would platform this. And they read it and they approved of it. There were 4 editors approved of it. So, but, after Alan, initially distanced himself from the thing that the right-wingers were calling SoCal squared, he started to associate more and more with them. And then he started echoing turf transphobic nonsense. And it was really astonishing because his arguments were a complete and total betrayal of scientific realism as I've known it, which is to say radical realism. Many of the postmodernists and relativists also said bad things and collaborated with reactionaries or turn reactionary, but it was always critical in my plan for this book to spend the back half tearing into similar patterns around the science warriors. And I was talking about how the book was originally, it started out as a review of Miranda's Prophets Facing Backwards before it massively diverged, and I scrapped almost all of that. But from inception, it began with a story about Miranda signing the Harper's letter on free speech published by J.K. Rowling, and Nanda's daughter being astonished and be like, my mom's not a transphobe, what's happening? And it was shocking and scandalous to me because I liked Miranda and found a lot in common with her, right? And kind of common experiences through this. And, you could point across the science warriors at, so many different people like Noam Chomsky, who are always kind of saying annoying things or being liberals about whatever with awful takes. And Sokal's collaborator on one of his books, Brickmont, even turned into an outright Holocaust denier in some grotesque escalation of anti-Zionism. But Sokal's line was that there was this strict biological definition of sex that cleaves into a binary, forget the exceptions, and it must be preserved from transfeminist critiques. And, I spend the back half or the back section of the book tearing apart his arguments over a pretty lengthy chapter. And, but there's a line that he said that it really sticks in my craw and just infuriates me to no degree. And I have it written down. It's saying that quarks are constructed is wrong, but at least it's subtle. Saying that sex is socially constructed is, you don't have to be a scientist to realize that's wrong. And he says this before this room of young Tories at this organization that had tried to legally threaten C4SS actually, because we had exposed some racist that one of their members had said. And he says it before this room, and it's just this complete and utter rejection of radical realism, of the scientific realism that I was enmeshed in when I was trained as a physicist. It's just totally at odds. Once upon a time, it may have been a valid scientific hypothesis to suspect that there was this binary sex thing, and with some concrete biological root reality. But scientists don't take assumptions and appearances on face values. And biologists did the investigation and learned that the physical dynamics that the theory was trying to explain and encapsulate were actually massively more complex. So, our crude rule of thumb shorthand, even with things like chromosomes, turned out to be papering over a vast galaxy of complicated gene responses, hormonal regimes, etc. And, no physicist would ever tolerate a theory that had that kind of complications and that kind of non-universality, which is immediately be recognized as not really a real thing, just an arguably useful fiction towards some specific ends. In short, something socially constructed and judgeable on its utility. What Sokal does in order to try to save biological sex is write off the catastrophic exceptions as small a number. Ascend to saying, it's like saying that there's only 2 atoms in the universe, hydrogen and helium, because everything else, carbon, iron, whatever, is vanishingly small in number by comparison. And further, he has to legitimize and appeal to the very sort of teleology that his old enemy Aronowitz wanted to introduce. In short, he has to say that there's like an intended order or an intended state of affairs, which we must judge as like broken or dysfunctional when it fails to like fit the simple like model that he has. And that's just not how the core of science works. Evolution doesn't have intentionality. We anthropomorphize because like we assign such. There is nothing objective about how we draw boundaries of organisms or species. They're messy, complex aggregate systems of incredibly vast numbers of constituent particles. There's no such thing as an objective ontology of the universe where giraffe is like a thing. You know, an alien from outer space could choose to look at all the particles and conceptually slice things up in a different way. It's just so trivially and obviously the case that giraffe is a social construct that we pick out and use these particular patterns from a human vantage point, serving particular uses and ends to us. What the objective reality underlying all the distribution of stuff is the distribution and the universal structures to like how that matter can flow or relate. An alien scientist would recognize quarks as a thing. They may slightly conceptualize them slightly differently, but they would definitely recognize something like quarks. But, you know, they could easily not conceptually distinguish between a single giraffe and like its wider ecosystem and just see this whole thing as one entity. So of course, like quarks are not socially constructed. And of course, like sex is. Like people grab onto certain crude patterns around hormones and chromosomes and gametes, and because there's like an existing social practice of gender that shapes our conceptual schemas. It's just trivially true that sex is socially constructed and that we should not try to even speak of sex and gender as separate. There are material realities that matter. Yes, they really matter. Whether a girl can get on the hormonal regime that she wants, like it matters. Hormones are real molecules. They exist. They have all too important consequences. But this giant aggregate thing that we label with sex is not real in any deep sense. It's this crude, arbitrary rule of thumb shaped by particular social interests. It's socially constructed in every sense of the term. And so Cowell's realism is like the prime example of the kind of reactionary realism that I was talking about, where at first blush it seems to be the case, you know, then it is the case. It's a sort of perspective that just defends common sense and naive assumptions from the common man because like the simple must be true unless it like overwhelmingly falls apart at like the perception of the common man, like because the sex does fall apart once you look at it with any depth. It's just like it's an embrace of good enough and then a willful refusal to interrogate the social like uses or perspective embedded in good enough, like good enough towards what ends. It's just a knee-jerk hostility to updating one's model of the world. Yeah. And, you know, I could say so much more about Cowell's politics, his liberal assumptions, the like hilariously like awful arguments of transphobic reactionaries that he sees his comrades and pulls from when he's, you know, making his arguments himself. I spend a subchapter that almost itself is a whole chapter like dogging on Kathleen Stock. She's just hilariously bad at philosophy and science and like everything, you know, and plenty of trans folks have already written critiques of these figures, et cetera. But I felt it was necessary in the book to like drag to the front, like after having built up an argument for realism that I think works against certain extreme skepticist attacks, to then turn to what Cowell's defense of realism is. And it just doesn't work. His doesn't work. And it's a betrayal of anything that would be strong enough to like defend the existence of matter and like against like extreme skepticism. So I just find, you know, the turn that he took is offensive on a moral level because it, you know, he's facilitating genocide against trans folks and the increased reactionary currents and fascist currents in the British Isles. And, you know, he's written letters of support for certain things. He's written letters of support for conversion therapy. That's beyond heinous. But it's also just like philosophically like infuriating and disgusting because like the arguments are so bad. They're so incredibly bad. And they violate what I saw as like the core fight for realism within the science war. But you have to recognize that the whole way through, what he meant by realism was probably something closer to a more fundamentalist realism than a radical realism. And it just got like hidden amid the giant conflict where there were two teams and everyone got grouped together in that. Right. There's so many other things. There were other reactionaries I didn't really get a chance to dog on. And I actually emailed and was talking with Mirananda, and I asked her point blank, like, are you like, what are your takes on gender and sex? And she never responded in email. She never wrote back. So, you know, it's very disappointing and infuriating, and a huge part of why I wrote the book.
As an anarchist in a science, what affinities do you see between these categories, and what do you hope they'll take away from this book and from each other?
Well, I'm not a scientist in a practicing formal academic sense. I'm not employed in physics, and I focus my work more on philosophical issues. I do have an educational background, but that's not quite the same thing, at least in terms of how, established scientists would consider it. But even before I was educated as a theoretical physicist, I always saw very strong parallels between anarchism and science. To me, they're both deeply utopian. Science is about egalitarianism and building a common treasury for all, or at least that's one component of it, in terms of how it operates and its ideal as scientists want to operate. And I've seen some really stunning instances of principled selflessness from scientists who really, truly believe in the utopian vision of science, even as they absolutely hate the institutional structures of science and the elitist bifurcation of science from everyone else, so that there's only an elite few who get to know it via an education system that beats any sort of interest out of them and is structurally just completely hostile to science, even while it pretends to kind of support it just to get more people to build technology for the state. I see scientists and anarchists as both radicals, and I have endlessly harped on that same phrase. And I wrote a piece 10 years ago called Science is Radicalism that even in the title was dogging on Aronowitz. And so, I've been zeroing in on this for a long time. I see both as chafing to disprove crude aggregate abstractions like nations, and both deeply conservative universals and little hidden tricks that can change everything. We're both utterly uncompromising. In fact, well, if something's true, it's just not up for debate. If there's a good model, if there's good evidence for it, and the evidence is sufficient past a certain point or whatever, it's not to say that you can't reevaluate or what have you, but you can't pretend as though the evidence isn't good evidence. It's not very likely, right? And similarly, anarchists are notoriously unwilling to violate our principles and values for some big tent. So I think that there is a common kind of unruly inclination. That is not to say that I'm sanguine about the state of science as social practice. And, the conclusion of the book, I write about how scientists need to return to utopian roots, and scientists need to see themselves as insurgents, in part because the landscape is changing. And the state that once tried to buy off scientists for this very brief period after World War II, basically, and, put scientists in this golden cage where they could be controlled and curtailed and directed, the state clearly, at least the United States, clearly sees very little reason to keep them around. The United States institution right now under Trump is incredibly hostile to science, right? In a very explicit way. Scientists had better wake up and not pine around waiting to return to some golden era of liberalism. I really think scientists are prepared to be a bitter, hated minority without funding, and not just that, but facing repression. And outside the United States, it is obviously a horrific genocide in Gaza, but a component of that is the targeting of scientists and the destruction of universities and the destruction of knowledge. And that's the case in a ton of places. Deliberate targeting of scientists and repression in a way that a lot of scientists have become very liberal and have totally failed to prepare for, and have no grounding for what that would look like or how to exist in a way that isn't living off the teat of the state. So, I think you got to keep going and fighting for knowledge and learning. And a lot of anarchists have, shown paths for how to survive and make advances in very similar positions. So I'm not saying that scientists are anarchists right now. There are anarchist scientists, quite a few, but obviously not the majority of scientists. And but I do think that scientists have a lot to learn from anarchists.
And kind of flipping that around for listeners who are anarchists and would like some resources for building their literacy in the sciences, I'd love to hear some suggestions if you have any.
Yeah. It depends entirely into what you're into. A lot of really trash science rocks, sort of pop material out there that really misleads people. The big exception in terms of accessible public news and reporting on science is Quantum Magazine, which across the board is just super excellent. I'm a big fan of Lenny Susskind's The Theoretical Minimum lectures, which are available for free online. He's a kind of lovable, old, cantankerous, working-class leftist. He once grinned and gave me a giant thumbs up to my Stop Snitching t-shirt. And he gave this night course, or series of night courses on subjects in physics, intended to be targeted to working adults who have little mathematical background. It's a very accessible way to learn about black holes, general relativity, quantum mechanics, that kind of thing. And he's just a great teacher. Literacy in science in general right now is like so much easier to achieve than ever before, with YouTube channels and science popularizers finally putting in a ton of work. It may be too little too late, but it's at least really inspiring in some ways. Off the top of my head, there's Milo Rossi and Stefan Milo in archaeology. I just start listing all sorts of different fields, but Angela Collier in physics is really great. And she has a specific video that I can't remember the name of, where she gives an appropriate list of textbooks and resources to self-train in physics. And so it's maybe beyond me to be like, here are the best people in biology or the best people in chemistry or what have you. But there's a lot of things like that are out now. Yeah.
Cool. That's great. I'll compile some of the stuff also from prior presentations that you've done and what you just mentioned and put them in the show notes as links. Yeah. What other things do you have coming up?
Well, I do a few things, but in terms of writing, I have a number of articles forever in the editing pipeline. So I have a retrospective on the emergence of fascism in the last 10 years. It's a little self-indulgent. I may even title it a self-indulgent retrospective. I have a much longer piece diving into large language learning models and the AI bubble from like an anarchist lens, critical in a huge array of directions. I just have endless writing projects kicking around that are like small. My desktop is completely cluttered. And in terms of books, I have 2 books that have been long in the pipeline, half done. One is half done, the other is less done, but I have a book I've been writing on markets that responds to left communists and market abolitionist anti-civs. And then I have a book on meta ethics and ethical philosophy that tries to establish a certain perspective that I have within anarchism is like a broad ethical sort of framework. I don't know if I'm going to get any of those done. Life is complicated. The world is constantly on fire. But those are things that hopefully will get done at some point.
Well, yeah, now that you've got this one book that you read hundreds of books in order to put together, hopefully you'll be able to find the juice to be able to go for the next one. And time will tell. But I really appreciate this conversation and I appreciate the book. It was definitely challenging for me to read, not having a background in sciences or in philosophy, but Wikipedia is your friend and imperfect.
Well, you made it through.
Oh yeah. Hell yeah. Yeah, I enjoyed it very much. Thanks again, William, for having this conversation and for the work that you do.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
This is The Final Straw Radio. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books. Located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville, Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.